So in part 2, I'm going to implement the API service, which is going to include methods to make the network requests and then also an observable of the loading endpoints. So let's first create those loading endpoints. So that's going to be a private property loading endpoints, and this is going to be an array, but it's going to be a new behavior subject. And we're going to start with an empty array. And every time we make a request, we're going to append to this behavior subject. Now I'm going to define a private method call, which is going to call the API, and this is going to return an observable of type any. I don't often use the any type, however in this instance this request could return anything, and it's why I like to have then the public methods to actually make these requests, so I can have a bit stricter typing. So here I'll call one get user, which is going to take username as a string, and that's going to return an observable of user. And then we're also going to have get user setting. We'll just leave that with no parameters at the moment, and that's going to return user setting. Now I want to define two more private methods. Private start loading, which is going to return void because it's not going to return anything, and then also stop loading. These could be public methods, but I don't expect that they'll be called outside of this service, so they're going to be private. Now I do want to expose the loading state publicly, so a common convention here is to create a public property based on loading endpoints. I'm just going to call it loading in this instance, and although here we're setting an array, so I'm just going to set that type to array of string, I'm actually going to set this one to be an observable boolean. So loading is just going to tell us whether any of our endpoints are loading. We'll implement that shortly, and then I'm going to implement a method for loading endpoints, which is going to tell us, well, it's going to take an array of endpoints and tell us whether any of those are loading. So let's define that here, public loading endpoints, using the dollar convention. And that's going to return an observable boolean as well. Save. Command-Shift-T, let's switch over to our tests. The first method I'm going to implement is call. So I'm going to describe call. I like to wrap each method in a describe block and its block afterwards, which says what it should do. It should make an HTTP post request. Okay. So the first thing I know I need is the HTTP client injected in our service. So I will call private HTTP, and I will include the HTTP client. And we'll see down here that our tests start failing because we haven't provided the HTTP client to our API service. Now, one thing I did forget to install, let's go back to our terminal and clear that, was TS Mockito. It allows me to quickly mock services, and I'll show you how to do that in 1 second. So that's finished installing, so let's define our providers here, which is an array, and I want to pass in an object which provide the HTTP client service, and I want to use a value of, I want to get an instance of a mock. These are methods provided by Mockito of HTTP client. And now if I go back to Wallaby, we'll see tests are passing again. So now we can have a look at our implementation. So all this call method is going to do, it's going to take an endpoint and then make a post request on our HTTP service and then expect some data to be returned. So what I actually forgot here is that call is going to need to take some options. So let's create an interface and we'll call it API service call options. And we'll just have one option, which is going to be endpoint, and that's going to be a string. So let's copy that. And call is going to take options, which is going to be of type that. Now we're going to expect, so let's expect our service. We're going to use square brackets and a string because otherwise TypeScript gives us an error because this is a private method. Call, and pass in an endpoint, which could be anything. Get user. We're going to expect that to be observable, and we're going to define that shortly. So let's define our marbles now. So we've got one which is the request, and that's going to be some time passes, and then we have some data, and then another one which is going to be the expected outcome. Let's put those in line, which is going to be some time passes, and then the same. So to do this, I'm going to create some spies. I'm going to spy on service and HTTP client, and I'm going to spy on the post method, and I will return a value of a cold observable, and that's going to take the request marbles. And now I'm going to expect that this will be a cold observable as well, and it's going to take the expected marbles. And now let's implement that, because as we can see we've got failing tests. So let's come into our call method, and I'm going to return this .http.post, and let's see, it takes a URL and a body. So for URL, I'm just going to hard code in local API dot there, and then some port plus options dot endpoint. And I'm going to put that on a new line. And for body, at the moment, I'm just going to pass null. So if we take a look back at our tests, it is now passing. And I could add, we pass B here, and it's failing. And this is the great thing with Wallaby. I can see immediately it's going to pass. And then maybe we dispatch G. So we dispatch G. So these letters are just passing A as a string of actual data. With marbles, I can define here, if I wanted A to be a string, then now we're going to get failing tests still. I'm just going to delete this extra stuff I added. We're still going to get failing tests because for the HTTP service post request, I've defined A to be this string, and then we're expecting it to be just A as a string. So I also need to pass in here a string. And that's what I normally like to do. I normally like to define data here. So let's say, let's call this call response, and it's going to be an object which has foo bar. We're not actually testing any implementation over user or user settings yet, so we can just define anything here. We just want to make sure that it matches when it returns. And I also need to expect that service HTTP post to have been called. We only want it to be called once, and we also want it to be called with, so let's just take a look, we'd expect to have been called with these two params, so I'll just take those and paste them. And obviously options is not defined here because we've just passed in our endpoint here like that. So again, let's define some data, and I'll call it options, and we're going to set it equal to what we pass in here. So we've got options, and now we expect it to be equal to options endpoint, and we've got no failing tests, so that's all good. Now also I want to make sure that expect service start loading to have been called just once as well, and also stop loading has also been called, and we want start loading to have been called before stop loading. So obviously my test is failing now, so let's make that pass. So before the HTTP request, I want to call this start loading, and then after the HTTP request, I want to pipe, and we can do finalize. I want to call this stop loading. And tests are still failing. I expected a spy but got a function, and that's because under spies we want to spy on service, and then stop loading. We don't need to return anything here because that's just going to stub those functions. We also want to spy on start loading, and you'll see that we've got this TypeScript warning here, and again this is because they're private methods on this API service. So the way I get around that is I pass as any here, as any, and that gets around that validation issue. So as you can see, tests are still failing, and that's because these spies haven't been called, and that makes sense because we've called on finalize here, but in our marbles we've only defined that A occurs. We haven't defined a complete action, so I can use the pipe symbol to define complete. And if you notice, I do the one pipe, and now I've got, it's a little closer here, and I can click show difference in the Wallaby console, and I can see frame 60 matches as I'd expect, but frame 70 in the actual output is added and it's not existing here, and I'm expecting it to be a notification, has value false, kind C, which is a little difficult to find in the documentation, but that means complete. So I now know that if I add a pipe here as well, then tests are going to pass. Perfect. So now let's write tests for the start loading and stop loading methods. So we've got start loading and stop loading. Should append endpoint to loading behavior subject. Should remove endpoint from loading behavior subject. So to set some dummy data on that, we want to call. So let's put this under spies service, and this is a private method which is called loading endpoints. Let's define some data. Endpoints equals endpoint1, because it's just going to be an array of strings, and we can just call next because this is a behavior subject, and we can pass in endpoints like that. Now what I have forgotten to do is on start loading we expect this to take an endpoint as a string, and the same here for stop loading. And now let's make sure we update that in our call testing. So we expect start loading to have been called with, and that should be options.endpoint. Endpoint, and then let's just make sure it does call that options.endpoint, and the same for stop loading. Duplicate that. Cool, so those tests are passing again. Let's get back to our start loading and stop loading tests. So we've defined our data. Now we expect that here we just want to get value, and it should equal an array of end.1 and end.2, because that's what we're going to pass in to service.start loading. I'm going to pass in endpoint2. Okay, so tests are currently failing. Let's take a look and make these tests pass. So what we want to do is update this loading endpoints. So we can call next on that. And we want to update it. We want to append to the existing array. So let's get this loading endpoints get value. That's going to give me the value. And what I want to do is call concat with the endpoint. Now we can see tests are passing as expected. So endpoint1, and we append endpoint2. Now stop loading is going to be similar. We want to update the loading endpoints value, except we don't want to concat here. Instead we want to filter. So let's go filter this value and let's call that current endpoint, and we want the current endpoint to not equal endpoint. And then if that's true, we're going to, it will basically return all endpoints that don't match the one we pass in. So let's write the test for that. Sorry, I forgot to write the test to begin with. We can copy pretty much the exact same thing here. And we want to call stop loading. Let's add in a couple of endpoints as our original data, so endpoint 2. And then we're going to spy on loading endpoints. We're going to pass in that data there. And then stop loading is going to want to stop loading endpoint 2. As we can see, our tests are failing as expected at the moment, and I can show difference. And it shows me here, again, this is Wallaby, it's brilliant, that we're expecting endpoint 2 to not, well, we're expecting it to be there, whereas actual it's not there. And that's what I would expect, that I need to remove this. I think I'm going to call it there for this video. I will see you in part 3, where we'll have a look at exposing the loading observable for consumption on other components and services.